Tennent, welcome to Apollos Watered.
Hey, Travis, it's great to be with you. Thank you so much.
I'm so excited to have you on the show, but here we go. We have our Fast Five. Are you ready?
I am ready for the Fast Five. Bring them on.
Okay, here we go. You are in Kentucky, but you're from Georgia. So here's the question. University of Kentucky or the University of Georgia?
University of Kentucky, they know how to throw a basketball.
Okay. How about this one? You're also a missiologist. Strangest or weirdest food you have ever eaten?
The strain was a live octopus, which you're required to swallow whole in Korea. Yes, it went down my throat live.
The whole thing or just the tentacle?
The octopus, and it's served live, and you take it, it's a little baby octopus, and you swallow it whole, and the phalanges are squirming as they go down your throat. It's quite an experience. India couldn't match it. I love Indian food, but this was a Korean experience. And of course,
okay,
it's raw. It's a raw thing too.
All right, here we go. You did your doctoral work at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland, right?
That's right.
Okay. Can you do a Scottish accent?
We blimey so, yes. Therefore, your honest sonsy face, great cheeky of the race. You have to learn how to ask for haggis there.
Oh, that's so good. That's so good. I like it. Oh, I love it when people can do a good Scottish accent. That's good. Okay, here we go. What is one of the perks that you enjoy as being the president of an evangelical seminary?
Well, they provide a beautiful home for me to live in. I live in the presidential home, and so people often come to it and say, "Wow, what an amazing house!" And we say, "Well, we're like renters here. We just we get to live here, but yeah, we get a nice, beautiful home to live in."
So this is not part of the Fast Five, but just because you have all your books, Timothy C. Tennent, do you ever tell people after you've been president that the C stand for chief?
Not yet, but good idea. I remember that.
Okay, here we go. If you were a make,
I just tell them it's not Stanford. It doesn't stand for Calvinist. That's the one thing. Other than that, I hadn't thought of the positive opportunity.
What does the C stand for?
It stands for Craig.
Oh, Timothy Craig. Okay.
What is that? Oh yeah, it tells you a lot, doesn't it?
I don't know what it tells me, but it tells me something. Okay, here we go. If you were a make and model of a car, what would it be and why?
If I was a make and model of a car, I don't know, probably a Ford Explorer.
Oh.
Kind of like, functional, but, not have a little class to it, but not too fancy.
Nice.
But, just kind of I'm a workhorse.
There we go. That's good. That's good. I really like that. It's a great description. I love that. Okay, here we go. So tell us a bit about your story. You're a very eclectic guy. I mean, you're from Georgia. You've gone to school at Princeton. You've studied Hinduism. You've studied Islam. I mean, just reading your bio, it's like this guy's been all over the place. Tell us a bit about who Dr. Timothy Craig Tennent is.
Well, I was born in Georgia, and very early on, I happened to grow up in an exclusively Jewish neighborhood in Atlanta. I was the only Gentile in the neighborhood.
Wow!
And so they called me Goyim. I was like the local, Gentile boy. But I guess from the very beginning, I was formed by what it was like to be an other, someone other than the surrounding communities. I was a minority in my community, of course, and went to an all-Jewish school and took Jewish girls to the prom and so forth, because that was my life. And so I had a real interest in learning about the world, about other people. And the Lord opened up a lot of wonderful doors to work and serve in India. I have a great love for India, especially North India. And so that opened up a lot of doors for me. So that brought me into kind of the field of missions and of thinking about things cross-culturally. And that led me through my life. I never actually thought about my career like a plan to do anything. I was a pastor, and I was going to be a pastor till I died. But then things opened up and exploded. Next thing now, I was in Nigeria, and one led to another. I needed another degree. I go back to school. So things kept happening. And I actually said to someone recently, I know it sounds bizarre to say this, but I've actually never in my life applied for a job. Isn't that amazing?
Wow.
I've never applied for a job in my life. Every job came to me, and I realized, oh, I guess this is the next step. So, I wasn't going to be at Gordon Conwell until I died. I never dreamed I'd be at Asbury. But things just came along, and next thing I know, I'm answering the call of God. So I'd love to say it had some big, plan. There was no plan. It all just kind of unfolded haphazard way, and here I am.
So, okay, so you've gone to, you did a PhD in non-Western Christianity at the University of Edinburgh, but yet you did a THM in Islam. Is that right? In ecumenics. That's right. I was going to say eurythmics, but that's not right. It's ecumenics.
Well, I was working in India already before I went to Princeton, and I had a real burden for what could be done in universities in Africa. So the organization IICS, it's now called Global Scholars, International Institute of Christian Studies in those days, Daryl McCarthy, they contacted me and said, would you be interested in teaching in Africa? And so one led to another, going to Nigeria, and I wanted to learn more about African Islam. So the whole thing at Princeton was to learn about African Islam. But later, when that kind of all blew up and I ended up back in the US, my real heart was always in India. So I decided on the doctoral level to pursue Hinduism and try to better understand why the church had so many problems propagating in India. What were the barriers? And that got me into missiology. And I had a wonderful opportunity to study in Scotland. So we were there for 3 years. I had a great time. That's when I came to Gordon Conwell after that.
Wow. So
Travis, we met at Gordon Conwell, right?
Yeah, that's where we met. I was in your class, and you would preach at a kurta, and I started preaching at kurta. I thought that was normal.
That's right.
I got to go to India myself, preached at all this African clothes, and whatever. I always told people whatever clothing they would give me, I would wear. And this was right outside of Chicagoland. And I have a guy in my office one day, and he's a Caucasian guy, and he says, "You said you'd preach in whatever cultural garb we give you." I said, yeah. And he walks out of my office, comes back in with a Sports Authority bag. And it's a University of Wisconsin t-shirt. And I'm like, that's my Nineveh. I can't go there. I'm in Chicagoland. That's just not where we go. But I'll talk other cultures.
I get a funny story about that.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I was going down to South India and to Kerala to visit a very, very important leader. And his son and I worked together up in Dehradun. And so the son said to me, now, I want you to know that my father has never worn a pair of pants in his life. He's a very traditional India, and he wears what's called a dhoti, which is like a long kurta, full-length kurta down to the ground, So he said to me, just so you be aware of that, he'll meet you at the train station. So I said, you know what? I want to honor your father because I believe in cross-cultural communication. I'm going to wear the full dhoti down into Kerala and meet your father. And he said, great. So they got me all dressed up, and it's a very difficult thing to get dressed in. And I got on the train, arrived in Kerala, got out the train. There he was waiting for me, and he had a pair of pants on. I was shocked. So I went through my whole deal. He took me to his organization. I spoke, I preached. So eventually we come back to his home for a meal. And of course, for if there's any Malayalis out there, they'll know that fish curry was the thing on the schedule. That's the classic Indian dish, mean curry, they call it. So we had this fish curry. And when things kind of got relaxed, I said, by the way, your son told me something. I just want to get it air cleared that you had never worn a pair of pants in your life. And here you are today in a pair of pants. And I had never worn a dhoti in my life. And here I wear a dhoti. He burst out laughing. And he said, I got this morning. And he said, it's true. I've never worn a pair of pants in my life. He said, I thought I better honor you. I would wear a pair of pants for you today. Here I was wearing a dhoti for him. So we had a cross-cultural cross.
That's good. A great story.
So we changed back to our respective outfits and went on from there.
So, you've got such an education in such an eclectic background, and yet your most recent book, For the Body, is a bit, it's different from what you've done in the past. I mean, you've written on holiness, you've written on world missions, you've written on a lot of different things, but this is a book that is not necessarily missiology in the classical sense of it, although I think it's equipping the church for language in a theology to embrace and accomplish the mission of Christ in this world. But tell us a bit about the impetus behind this book for the body. And it's not talking about for the body of Christ as much as it is our actual physical bodies, and why we need to pay attention and have a theology of the body. But talk to us a bit about the impetus behind it and why you wrote this book and what's in it.
Yeah, Travis, thank you. That book was a little bit of a surprise, and since it wasn't my normal kind of writing space, as you know, I'm a missiologist, but as you know, missions is about connecting text with context. And so in some ways, it's a little like Leslie Newbegin, and I'm trying to understand how to be a better communicator of the gospel to the Western world. And right now, one of the biggest issues has to do with the body, in particular gender reassignment and some of the challenges with our own bodily identity. So in just surveying the evangelical church, and this is not to be critical, I think it's what always happens when these things come up at first, is that I basically found that we hear a lot about what Christians are against, but we don't really hear what we're for. And I think a lot of the people in the culture seem to know we're against a lot of things. They don't really know what is the grand vision that we're for. This book is really trying to lay out the positive vision for the body, the human body, and the body as an icon or a pointer to the resurrection, the incarnation, the Trinity. The whole book really goes through and shows how God has designed the body as a pointer to spiritual realities. And so the book really does provide, I think, hopefully a positive vision for why we think practices like gender reassignment are a very troubling trend for our society. And so this book lays out that case.
Now, what do you think? Why do you think that we've really missed this idea? I mean, we've talked about what we're for, and I know in the book you talk about being in a post-Christian culture, and that's one of the things that we talk a lot about on this show, is that our culture shift. And while there are pockets of Christendom, definitely in the West that we see, and people can operate within that for a sphere, but if you're engaging with the greater Western society as it started to change, we have to learn how to engage that, and we need to have a proper theology of the body, something that the church has not largely done in the West very well traditionally. Why do you think that is? Why do we have such a hard time having such a view or a proper theology of our bodies?
It's a great question. If you look back to the early church, the first 2-3 centuries, Gnosticism was the biggest challenge they faced. And Gnosticism was a view of the body which denigrated the body and basically said what really matters is the real you inside of you. You could be literally a man trapped in another body, or a spirit with a true spirit inside of you. All the things we hear today were very much a part of the early church's challenge. And so the New Testament is born out of that context, but then it became the church prevailed over that. And essentially, you've had a very positive, robust view of the body throughout most of Western civilization. So we've just basically forgotten that this problem could reemerge. We didn't think it could reemerge. And we basically have a neo-Gnosticism reemerging today in the church and in the culture. And as the Christian worldview has receded, that has been replaced by non-Christian worldviews. And one of those is a new form of Gnosticism. So we're having to relearn what the church had already learned, unfortunately, in the past. This is not a new issue. It's just an issue we had to revisit and to recapture. And the church basically always forgets yesterday's battles. We only think about the battles that we have. And so, unfortunately, we're going to have to go back and do our homework and think about why did John say, we have seen him with our eyes, we've touched him, our hands have handled. Because John, and if anyone does not believe that Jesus has come in the flesh, he's the Antichrist. And John really, it's bold language.
Yeah, he goes after
Paul
him.
was saying, if this is just a Greek idea, this is just a philosophy, then this is not the Christian gospel. It's about something that happened in the flesh. And therefore the flesh must be trustworthy and must be, the Christian gospel has always said that the body is trustworthy, the heart is deceitful. And the culture, of course, has flipped that and said the body is completely untrustworthy, but you can always trust your heart. And that's the thing the church has to readdress today.
It seems like what we've seen, and I had a conversation with Nancy Piercy a while back, and we were talking about the difference between hardware and software. And we have the hardware, and usually you used to want to make the software fit the hardware, but now we're trying to get the hardware to fit the software.
Yeah.
I mean, just in in a contemporary parlance terms. But why is this? I mean, we talk about Gnosticism, and a lot of people then kind of tune out. They don't really know what Gnosticism is. I mean, they hear the term, we say gnosis, knowledge, that's where you get back to the root of it. But let's talk here for a moment, just to draw this out, to really bring people into this. How is Gnosticism? I mean, we know what it is historically, and you might want to give just a brief definition, but then draw that out in how it is affecting us in our understanding in the here and now.
Yeah, great question. This is there was a lot of mystical movements, special knowledge movements in the early church, and around that time. And so one of these is kind of called collectively Gnosticism, but it's actually, this is not a movement like we would say Christianity like is a movement. Right. This is actually multiple movements which are collectively called Gnosticism. And the one thing they had in common, these mystery movements, was they believed that God could not create the world because the world would sully God. It would make him, he was above all of that. And so he had to create some space between God and the world, these so-called demiurges or some kind of separate being between God. And so there was not a real strong doctrine of creation. So one thing the Jews had was, of course, a very powerful doctrine of creation. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And so you have this direct sense that God fashioned and made the world. Well, the Gnostics didn't accept that. They didn't believe that. And so therefore they didn't have this whole thing is really based in a weak view of creation. So once you lose your view of creation, then of course you lose your own view of yourself as a body. So they said, going back to, Plato, et cetera, they're saying, well, the real vibrancy of a person is not the body, but the spirit within the body. The real you is not your body, it's you. And the Jewish worldview and the Christian worldview along with that believed in the connectivity between the body and the spirit. That these are one. These are not separate things. We don't denigrate the body. So the early church was fighting this a lot, and it became an ongoing challenge. So it really comes down to a weak view of creation. The problem is, if you have a weak view of creation, it immediately follows on that you can't have a strong view of the incarnation, which is the real main point that the church had to fight. Because if the incarnation is not trustworthy, if God could not come in the flesh, then you have a real problem, because the gospel is predicated on that fact. So if you don't have a trustworthy creation, you don't have a trustworthy incarnation. And so that became really the nexus around which the whole thing surrounded. Then today, of course, now for at least 50 years, we've lost a strong doctrine of creation in our culture, that God created the world. So it only follows, in due course of time, we lose a doctrine of the body. And so this is really a re-emergence of the same basic ideas that floated around for several centuries in the early church.
So let me make sure I got this right here, because we're talking about Gnosticism. And again, people are still trying to figure out this bridge between Gnosticism back then. But back then they're saying the body didn't matter. That's what we're saying, is that the view was the body didn't matter. And that affected our understanding of the incarnation. Because if the body didn't matter, I mean, Jesus didn't come in the flesh, but he did. We know that he did. He ate. I mean, John makes special emphasis on that he ate, that he said, touch me, interact with me. And we see then that there's this unification then, or understanding of the incarnation, as you just mentioned. And then today, though, people are saying that I'm not my body. I'm not my gender. I'm not I'm not what my biology dictates that I am. It's what I feel on the inside.
Right.
And then, so we hear that going on everywhere today, and we see it all over our culture. How then, so your idea is we have to then recover an understanding of creation, that it is good, that God made us as created, gendered beings, right?
Exactly. Absolutely.
And then in that, there's a purpose. And you talk about that. It's the means of grace. It's how we understand the grace of God, who God is. Elaborate on that for a bit, because you touch on that in the book.
Yeah, I believe that it's very important to see that our bodies are actually designed to point to spiritual mysteries. Now, I use the word icon, but icon just means a window into something spiritual. So if you actually take an icon, the icons were designed so that you always focus your eye on, it would always direct the icon directed to your own eyes. And so it's meant to be not a picture like just a painting, but a window to a spiritual reality. You could just say, it's a pointer, but a spiritual pointer. But the idea is that your body is a pointer to the incarnation. We all know that the husband and wife is a pointer to Christ in the church.
Right. We
all know that childbearing, to have father, mother, child, is a pointer to the Trinity. The communion of the Trinity is meant to be mirrored in the community of the family, all of these things. So once you destroy the body, once you destroy marriage, the fruitfulness of marriage and childbearing, all those things, you lose that which they point to, the spiritual mysteries. And so John Paul II began to lecture on this pretty strongly back in his papacy in the 80s. And it was very influential throughout the Roman Catholic world, but it was not really brought very clearly into this Protestant world until a man named Christopher West began to write books really directed to the Protestant world, and it opened up a lot of new scholarship. I mean, Nancy Pearcey, you mentioned her, a lot of us were writing on this theme, and we owe a lot to the Roman Catholic work on this area that's been going on. And we're trying to now put it kind of in our own terms, our own ways, about how what it means to embody the gospel and not just preach it, but actually see that we embody it through our daily lives.
Where do you think that understanding went awry? Because I see the church today, the modern Western evangelical church, it's very pragmatic and it's very business oriented, although we talk about Jesus, but it's more of you follow Christ, you surrender your life to him, which is awesome, but there's not a theology of how this affects or permeates different aspects of our lives. And that's what you're calling the church back to, in a form of catechism. And you talk about that in the book of catechesis, of instructing people. How can the church then grasp onto this? So I have two parts to this. Where did the church go awry? And how basically can we recapture this idea?
That we could definitely recapture it. The problem is that the church quit catechizing new members into, disciple them into the faith. That's the basic problem. So in my world, the Western world, we call this the first half of the gospel and the second half of the gospel. The first half of the gospel being justification, second half being sanctification and growth and discipleship. And I think, unfortunately, in the modern period, there's been such an emphasis on lowering the bar, making the gospel simple, reducing it to very, kind of bite-sized pieces. You could actually go into many of the kind of big box churches today, and what you're actually hearing is not a message of salvation, but a message of justification. Now, praise God for that. We're not against that. But the point is, you can't confuse justification with salvation, because salvation is a much larger transformational project that God's involved in with us. And so part of our concern is that we have not really passed on the faith well. We aren't training our children well. And it used to be that for a while, we survived on kind of cultural cues where there was a kind of a cultural Christianity where certain things were passed on through the culture, but that's obviously now evaporated. So we're left essentially with a church that's uncatechized. That's a serious problem. And no church can survive that. No church can survive that because the culture is doing a lot of catechesis day in and day out. So if you think about the full force of cultural formation is very powerful in this culture. So to counteract that, we need more than a 20-minute sermon on Sunday morning. We need some more serious. So what we're trying to do is, and I have another book coming out this year on catechesis, which lays out kind of the whole vision. But the church has to understand, in the early church, they had two phases of it. One phase was during Advent, the whole period before before Lent, before Easter. During Lent, they would go through instruction. You become a Christian, baptized at Easter, and then another phase where you learn what it's like to be a member of the church, called mystagogy, which went all the way to Pentecost. So the church actually had 2 phases of instruction for everybody. One phase before you became a Christian, justification. One phase as you received the Spirit and grew in your faith. And all that's pretty much evaporated into very either nothing or very short kinds of things, because we've moved to this kind of user-friendly, ask no questions, make it simple, kind of Christianity, which is not reproducible in the long run.
Is that just an American gospel?
Well, unfortunately, this is a global challenge. It's not simply an American problem. This has been a problem around the world. Now, it's true, some churches have stronger commitment to catechesis than others, but this is really it's not really an American gospel so much as it is as a kind of a shallow gospel that is taking one part of the gospel, making that the whole thing, and baptizing that. And that's unfortunate. That happens all across Africa, happens in Asia, happens all over the world.
So how does a rediscovery then of this doctrine of the body, and you're really calling for a rediscovery of the doctrine of creation itself, but let's set it aside here as under that umbrella of the doctrine of creation. But how does a rediscovery of this grow an understanding of who Christ is? Because I can hear a lot of pastors right now saying, you don't know my people. They're not going to sit around for this. They're so busy. We can barely get them on a Sunday morning anymore. This is extra. This is superfluous. This is more on than what I need. It's great if we get to it, but I just don't see that being a part of it. What would you say to that mentality and mindset?
Well, I'll say that in time, we will see more of a hunger for it, because as the culture crunches down, people were going to want to learn and know more about their faith. And so we're seeing this in many of our churches that are in highly contested areas where the culture, and this is both true in India as well as here, we do see a growing hunger for learning and growth in the gospel. So the idea that we should assume that people really can't be bothered. People have a lot of discretionary time, And the church's problem is that we're not willing to ask for that time. We should have the boldness to ask. But that being said, we have to also, and this is to the pastor's point, we sometimes think that everything has to be reduced to programmatic activity in the church, where you come out at a certain day or night or whatever to do things. And a lot of the good gospel work can happen in organic ways in the midst of life itself. And so there's a lot of ways we can help understand how growth can happen in ways that accommodate, our busy lives, et cetera. But I do think we should ask for more. But we also should be more creative.
Well, and you mentioned that in the book. You talk about how not just mentioning or asking for more, but you mentioned how this aspect permeates the family. And it's not just a Sunday morning thing, that it's communicating meaning, that if you adopt this view of the body, which is rooted in even creation itself and our understanding and how we're limited even in time, we need a Sabbath, we need rest. There is the creation of the family that's there, that's rooted in that as well. And then that transfers into the relationships that we have. So it really does permeate our understanding of everything. And that itself is a form of catechesis, because you mentioned that in the book. You said it's not about whether or not we're being catechized, it's who we're being catechized by. Who is the one who's communicating the meaning in our culture? Because our culture is communicating meaning all the time.
Exactly.
And the problem that I see is a lot of younger or people coming up today are so busy that they don't have time to stop and think. And they're caught up. Now, you mentioned discretionary time, and I know some people are saying, I wish I had discretionary time, but COVID has given some discretionary time, at least we think. But how do we then recapture that mentality in our churches? Because you're right, this creation idea does, to me, permeate everything, and it is an antithesis to the culture, or an antidote to the world that seems to be coming in everywhere we turn. I mean, it's busyness, it's idea of time, it's idea of how we view relationships, the transient value, or I think it was Saint Benedict that called it the gyrovagues, those who are in and out all the time, and we can't find any depth of relationship. You're saying, or it seems that you're saying, is that I'm calling for a depth to take root, to get to know, I mean, rediscover who God is, rediscover who we are as created individuals, and then that will permeate every relationship that we have, which is itself an understanding or an outworking of what the gospel is. Now, elaborate on that. I mean, do you agree? Do you disagree? Or I'm only getting a smidge of it?
No, it's a good point. I think we have to, we have to assess what do we really value, what do we really want to do with our lives, and how we want to form our lives. And I know in my own life, I'm the president. My life is completely packed from stem to stern. When I came to Asbury, I had the spirituality of a professor from Gordon Conwell. And when I got here, I realized early on that I was not spiritually equipped to handle the responsibilities and the decisions and all that I had to face, and just the endless issues that are before me. And yet my time is, I'm traveling every weekend. I'm speaking all over the country. It's very difficult to work it out. And so my wife and I realized at some point, I either had to leave the position and just give it up and say, I got to go back to what I know, which is teaching in the classroom, or I have to go to a deeper place in the Lord. So I would say, if you looked at my schedule, you would say, I have no discretionary time. How can I make it happen? But what I found was, my wife and I said, this was in 2012. I came here in 2009. This was in 2012. We decided to carve out an hour a day, an extra hour a day on top of everything else, to spend time completely in prayer and in the Psalms every day, the two of us together. And so we said, let's do this for 150 days and just see what happens after 150 days. So we did that. That started in 2012, and we have continued that to this very present day, including this morning.
Wow.
What I found was, despite, if I'm traveling, I might be in India or whatever, we still do it over the phone even, or Skype or whatever.
Wow.
We do it. It doesn't matter where I am, what I'm doing, in an airplane, in the airport or whatever, we do it. And I found that I've been so immersed in the Psalms since 2012, that it's become a part of who I am in terms of how I relate to the world, understand things. This was like one of the most formational, I don't plan on getting into all this, but since you asked, but
This is awesome
for my life. And so I had been like a lot of Christians. I'd become a Christian early on. I'd gone through kind of the normal kind of growth spurt you have. But then I went through years of just kind of like almost flat. I didn't know I was growing. I was just simply maintaining my faith. And suddenly I found myself in a growth period again, like I haven't had since I was a young Christian. It was very, very powerful for me. And it taught me that if we are hungry enough to really want to be formed by the gospel, the Lord will give us space and show us space in our lives to do it. And we found that true in our lives. And my life, if anything, the last 8 years has gotten, or 10 years now since I started this, gotten more complicated. And yet we are just persistently determined to keep growing in our faith. That's the church that we have to see reborn, and is that determination to stay before God, because this culture desperately needs authentic Christianity that's truly transformed. And they are not impressed by shallow Christianity. They're not impressed by all this. And we will never change the world by this, because we ourselves aren't changed. But if we're changed and we can show radical forgiveness, radical love, radical acceptance, yet also ourselves radically transformed, it's a powerful thing. And I still believe in it. I believe it's very possible. I don't believe the world can ever spin too fast for us to walk with the Lord.
That is where people live. And that's actually what we are about at Apollos Watered, because we see how the culture is just creeping in. And it's come down to this justification only Christianity, where it's this surface level. And actually, we've identified what we call not a new form of discipleship. We just put a name on it. We call it missio holistic,
Hmm.
where it's a holistic understanding of the body, the mind, all of those aspects, and even the spiritual realm, which we as Westerners don't do well with. And we know that our global brothers and sisters understand that world much better than we do. But we're saying, looking at discipleship and also putting the lens of culture on it. And it's all used to accomplish the mission of Christ. And that's what we're trying to articulate, is how do we help people follow Christ in the middle of an ever-changing, postmodern, pluralistic, whatever ism you want to throw on it world. It's changing all around us. And it's so encouraging to me to hear you guys going back and saying, this is what we're going to do. We're going to try this. And you said for 150 days, I'm assuming because of 150 Psalms. Is that how you did it?
Right.
So Psalm 119 probably took you guys a while. I mean, 176 verses. Come on.
It was 7 days. It was 7 days. Yeah. we didn't think smart enough to say we should have 157 days.
I mean, come on. That's nuts. I mean, God bless you, but hey.
I think we've now been through the Psalter. I think it's now we're in our 17th trip through, something like that.
Wow.
Today was Psalm 101, for example. But yes, we do that every single day.
An hour. You do it for an hour.
We do it for at least an hour, sometimes an hour and a half, but at least an hour every day.
So what does that mean when you do it an hour? You guys reading to each other? What are you doing?
So what we did, we took all the Psalms and we put them into metrical form. Of course, metrical psalters have been done all over the world. We wanted to actually make one that would be available to anybody. So we spent 2 years and turned every psalm into regular meters. It could be sung to tunes, that we all know and love. So what we do is, and by the way, those are all available on psalms.seedbed.com, which is the site that are on. But you can go and listen to the tunes. You can read through the Psalms, but we pray, we actually sing the psalm, and then we talk about it and we reflect on it. And what's amazing is the Psalms are like, it's basically 150 life journeys that puts out there before you. And those 150 journeys, some short, some long, as you said, they'll give you basically the catechesis for 150 potential situations in all of life. I found every psalm fits something I'm dealing with. And just as a joke on the side, though, when my wife and I were doing the metrical psalters, it took a lot of work. It took 2 years of work. And so I would do a psalm, she would do a psalm. And so at one point I said to her, I said, sweetheart, I tell you what, if you do Psalm, I'll do Psalm 117. You do Psalm 117.
What's got 3 verses?
Right. So if you did get our Psalter and get Psalm 119, my wife gets credit for that. God bless her. Good job. Anyway, but we sing, then we talk, then we pray through the psalm verse by verse, and it's very, very formative. And by the way, we have started not just the psalm singing, but Asbury started these small group like Wesley had. We're redoing the band meetings and the class meetings all over the country, all over the world. So we have thousands, Travis, of these band meetings right now taking place all over the world through our new room conference, our seedbed. And so what you have is people these are pastors that are, they're very busy, and yet they're coming together in these bands. And what we found was amazingly that the bands actually work even better under COVID requirements, because if you're band with somebody and you live in Georgia and your band partner lives in California, in some ways you're more vulnerable to that person in California because they don't know your world that much. And right. Part of the band, you ask people, how is it with your soul? What unconfessed sins are in your life? It's a serious conversation about your life, your inner life. And people are finding in these bands the spiritual permission slip to share openly what they're dealing with, what their problems are, and what their issues are. And you can imagine what they might be all over the map. And they're finding spiritual healing. And we began to have this conference, bringing people together. I never forget one time we were at we call these new room conferences. They're always in the fall. And we had probably 3,000 pastors there. And these are pastors that all have very good, solid ministries. I never forget one night, a Thursday night, We had nothing planned. It was restaurant night. It's back to my point about priorities and time. This was the restaurant night where everybody goes out Thursday night and just, goes to a restaurant and just relaxes a little bit. So the leader of our New Room conference, J.D. Waltz, said, I feel the Lord is just calling us to spend Thursday night in prayer. Come back and pray. It's not on our schedule. You don't have to do it, but if you feel led, I think God's calling us to come back and pray. So we went out, got a quick bite to eat, came back, and I walked in the auditorium. I was shocked. It was absolutely packed. Everyone came back. It was packed. I couldn't see any empty seats. And the Lord moved. And I never seen pastors, just ranks and ranks of pastors on their face before God, weeping, confessing their sins, being transformed. And at the end of that whole thing, I still get letters to this day about that night where pastors say, that night, my ministry was saved. That night, I was brought to a new place. And, they, of course, they probably needed to have a night off, and they needed to have, go to the restaurants, all that. But they realized there was something deeper they needed that brought even deeper refreshment. And I really believe that if we call our pastors to really, really get serious, they'll respond. And they will deal with the sin in their lives, and they will find themselves being sanctified and cleansed and filled with the Spirit. And I hope all these things are okay in your show, talking about things like this. But we believe in people being filled with the Holy Spirit and empowered, and the transformative power of that is very, very important. It's not just for Pentecostals; it's for everybody.
Right? No, I agree. I totally agree. And I want to thank you. I know your time is limited, and you got to run because you already said your schedule is pretty packed out. I want to thank you for coming on the show, but I also want to know want to let people know, or would you let people know how they can follow you or know more about what you're doing?
Well, I have a blog, just simple blog, timothytennent.com. And so I put my blogs out there, and my sermons are there, and things I've written or whatever I do is put on that blog site. They're welcome to follow me there. But most importantly, I always say the purpose of Asbury Seminary is to grow fruit on other people's trees. We don't do anything. We're producing people that hopefully go out and bear fruit. And I think the best way to test any ministry is to not look at the ministry itself, but look at the effects of it around the world. I know you're doing that for your podcast, Travis, and think about the possibilities. If you someday will know what will happen in your life through the people that you touch. And when I left Gordon Conwell, I was in a spiritual crisis because I loved three things. I loved teaching. I loved having sabbaticals and writing books and things like that. And I realized that all that was going to come to a stop, basically, by coming to Asbury, which it basically did. A lot of my stuff came to a halt. But the Lord spoke to me and said, the greatest impact of your life is not what you do, but what you enable others to do. And I think that to me is really what it's all about. It's not about necessarily what I write or what I say, but really, if you look at the fruit of our ministries, people that come through our lives, what they do when they go out and graduate or go out from our churches, that's the real fruit of our ministries. And that's what I pray for all of us.
That's a good word. Well, I just want to thank you again for coming on Apollos Watered, and we look forward to seeing the next book when it comes out. When's that supposed to come out?
This fall, hopefully, book on catechesis. Yes.
All right. We'll look forward to seeing that. And
thanks a lot, Travis.
Thank you for coming on the show.
God bless you. Bye-bye.